Both Steve and Lenny and I have had a little bit of a discussion about what it is we wanted to talk about today. And we decided we were going to make it a relatively broad conversation as opposed to a narrow focus on what would be technically called pure venture capital or venture investing, and to broaden it out to include basic research, direct investment, loan guarantees, government intervention, lender of last resort, all the wonderful theological subjects that, to quote, paraphrase Santorum, that we get caught up in. The one thing I wanted to say, and before I introduce Steve, who's going to be our first speaker, is that one of the things that's hard to remember in talking about this subject is that it's people that are making these decisions about what government does and doesn't do. And one of the fundamental questions that we often forget to ask is, how qualified are those people to be making these kinds of decisions? Not necessarily how qualified are the institutions to be. It's sort of an additional level that we have to always keep in mind. So first I'd like to introduce Steve Wesley. In your book you have a little bio, but I'd just like a couple of highlights here. Steve is currently a venture capital investor, but he was previously the chief marketing officer of eBay. You've heard of that little company. And after that, he went on to be our public servant as controller of the state of California. And he has a really terrific background. Steve and I know each other because we share the same shiatsu therapist out in Portola Valley. And with that, I will introduce Steve, but and Lenny, I think I want to just say something. And Lenny Mendonca he's also going to be on our panel. He's a senior partner and director both San Francisco and Washington of McKinsey and Company, the global consulting firm. And his particular area is expertise, the firm's communications and the shareholder council and the state and local, U.S. state and local public service practice for McKinsey and Company. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you first. And by the way, Lenny and I have shared the ability to be on the Bay Area Council, where Lenny did a terrific job as the chair. So you first, Steve.
Great. Well, first, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I was up this morning at 5 a.m. in Zurich. I just landed an hour ago, so I'm just lucky to be here at all. And if you like what I have to say today, chalk it up to my being incredibly articulate and foresighted. If you don't, chalk it up to jet lag. I'm delighted to be here. I've known George for a long time, and I just wanted to say one thing, and I rarely do this, but from the bottom of my heart, some of you know I ran for governor, and we literally reached out to the best and brightest policy minds in the state of California, and Lenny was one of the people who helped more than anybody, and is, frankly, for anybody who's looking at policy issues in the state, literally one of the most thoughtful people in California. So I'm delighted to be here. What they have said is that this is going to be a long day. We are catching you toward the end, and they said to be sure to be spicy and provocative. So I'm going to do my damnedest to do just that. And what I wanted to say is, and what I'm going to do today, is a full-on support of the Secretary of Energy, who I think has been one of the best Secretaries of Energy we've ever had, completely apolitical, has gotten more things done with a better team than, frankly, any Secretary we've seen. This is not what you frequently read in the press, but I will tell you exactly why you all should be proud of what the Department of Energy has done. First, the Department of Energy is not now, nor has ever been, a venture capitalist. They have given out a lot of loans and grants. They do not do venture capital. That is a complete anomaly. Second, there is this notion that there are these sort of hapless bureaucrats giving away money with no business giving away money. Nonsense. The Secretary has brought in the best and brightest people to run these programs, including one of the most articulate people in the energy space I've ever seen, Matt Rogers, who Lenny can talk about because he heads the global energy practice for McKinsey. Most of the people the Secretary brought in a very short period of time were leaders from firms like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and McKinsey. In short, precisely the people you would want to be injecting money into key strategic areas of the economy. So, the last thing I'll say, and then we'll turn it over to Lenny, and then we'll engage in a give and take, is what does the track record look like? It's terrible, right? I mean, Solyndra, we've all read about catastrophe. And what I'm here to tell you is 85% of the money that was put out largely into project power agreements, into things like wind and solar projects that will bring back a market rate of return and then some for the government. Of the 15% that was more speculative in manufacturing companies, there will absolutely be some misses, and there will be some great hits. I was involved in one of the great hits, Tesla. It's created a huge amount of jobs. The government did invest in this company. The government got warrants, which now are worth a fortune. When the government invested, I believe the stock was about at $3 a share. I checked it today. It's at 34. This is not bad. Now, there were some misses. There is always misses when you're moving quickly to create jobs in the economy and to move strategically key areas of the economy forward. And the government, our government, did in fact lose $400 million plus in Solyndra. A terrible mistake, but good heavens. Venture capitalists plugged $1 billion into Solyndra, and they missed too. I have not heard anybody calling for an end to venture capital investing in this country. The fact is, the Department of Energy, in a very short time period, put a substantial amount, roughly $70 billion, to work in the stimulus package in exactly the right industries, creating a supply chain for the industries of the future, keeping America's competitive edge in areas like batteries, electric vehicles, solar, and wind. And when the final history is written, people will say these were not only timely investments, they were smart investments, they yielded a market rate of return plus, and the people they brought in to give them, to make these investments, really represented, I think, some of the best and brightest in this country. So that's my opening salvo.
Very good, Steve. Thank you. Lenny?
So Steve at jet lagged is better than the rest of us when we're wide awake. So I have always enjoyed watching and collaborating with Steve, and look forward to this conversation in particular, since Steve's actually engaged in these businesses today as a principal actor. He's got more insight into what really works and doesn't. So I hope we have a chance to have a good, rich discussion. With that in mind, I'm going to be relatively brief and make really 4 points, all under the banner of we are not in your grandfather's industrial policy world today. And in fact, I think when you have people say, well, this is picking winners or losers, or this is failed industrial policy, you miss the point. And we need to get out of that language. What we really are in is, whether you like it or not, in all of the sectors that matter for the growth of the economy today, and it has been in the past, the government is a principal actor one way or the other. So understanding the role that the government's going to play and should play to help encourage the innovation, growth, and competitiveness of the U.S. and any other economy is extraordinarily important. Having said that, much of what government does is not very effective and has not been very effective in the past. As we heard today, there are large parts of the rest of the world who have tried to replicate Silicon Valley, and they've gone about it by deciding, well, the answer is you need to create a real estate environment that looks like Silicon Valley, or you need to throw a bunch of money at it, or you need to build a bunch of universities or hire a bunch of people to come over, and they miss the whole point about what's special about it. So part of what is the challenge of this is that when we talk about government intervention, industrial policy in the old terms, or in today's vernacular, government as a venture capitalist, you miss the point that you really need to think about it at a much more specific level about what are the sectoral characteristics of the industry in which government is going to play. And there are very different roles and very different needs depending on what the sector is. At a minimum, there are roles that the government has and does play for setting the basic policies for labor, capital, and land markets in the U.S., and it's one of the reasons why the U.S. has the most competitive retail sector in the world, because it's actually been pretty good at all of those. And with the exception of some local market regulations on land regulation, U.S. market regulations for land, U.S. labor market regulations, and the ability to scale retail formats is one of the reasons why the U.S. has some of the most innovative and productive retail sectors in the world. That's a very different role for government than in sectors like infrastructure, that fundamentally the government is a principal actor. They, by definition, are funding, setting not only the rules, but helping determine where that investment goes and are actually putting direct capital in it. There's a third role that they play as tilting the playing field, or in trying to set conditions for success. In today's world, that's extraordinarily important in globally traded activity, which is a lot of where the opportunities are going forward. And I'm not suggesting that we should be putting up protectionist barriers or doing uneconomic subsidies. But in a world in which every other government is engaging and trying to tilt that playing field in their favor, we need to understand what that looks like. And last, and probably least importantly, is on the policy spectrum where the government actually owns the businesses, is investing in them directly, or is providing direct financial support for them. So, I think what we need to do when we're talking about this is talk about at a much more specific level about what's the sectors we're talking about, what are their characteristics, and what's the role that the government can and should play that would be effective. Now, let me talk about that very briefly in the venture capital analogy. If you think about what the world's best venture capitalists do, and then I'm going to ask you as I'm saying each of these things to think about, do you think the U.S. or any other country is very good at this? And I would suggest generally no, but should be, and particularly in sectors that are going to be innovation-oriented, is number one, they assemble the best talent and make sure that it stays where they are. I don't think we're pretty good at that in this country. We tend to ensure that the best talent in the world comes here for education, and then we kick them out as soon as they're done with their degree. Secondly, they ensure that they're investing in really high-quality technology with a clear roadmap of where that might go and what the market potential is. I don't think in anything that we're doing in general in this country in terms of innovation policy we have any sense of priorities. We don't have any sense of the roadmap. We don't have any view about what's fundamentally important. The third thing that they do is either through their own or through the influencing it, they try and create an attractive ecosystem around there so that their company can not only innovate but scale. The U.S. has generally been pretty good at the early stage of investment and has not been great about scaling the manufacturing and other capabilities that are here. And last and least important, venture capitalists provide capital. Only do that when those other things are in place. And I think the challenge and the opportunity is to use the venture capital analogy, but use it properly for the components of the sector needs, and then be clear about what the role that the government can play, which isn't necessarily providing the least important part of that, which is capital, but providing and supporting the other elements that are necessary to enable innovation to succeed.
Thank you. Excellent. Would you like to get a few of these questions on the table?
Go ahead. No, you're the
That's fine.
moderator.
I like this. I like this very much. He prepared a couple of, I thought, very provocative. How should the public think about the U.S. government's involvement in renewable energy, as an example?
Yeah, I mean, look, top level, you often read in the paper, good God, government should never be involved in industry policy, these hapless bureaucrats. Nonsense. Our government has always had a role, from the railroads to aerospace to semiconductors to the internet. And we're all the beneficiaries of it. There would be no Silicon Valley without that. So that's generally a good thing. The question is, you always want to make sure the government doesn't overreach, goes too far, spends too money, does not do it wisely. I would just argue that what we've seen in the energy space for the last 24 months was generally, not perfect, but example of what went right. We saw money put to work quickly. We saw money put to work largely in industries that have a strategic importance to us. One, to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Two, to reduce the amount of pollution in this country, which is a growing concern. And three, again, to build the supply chain of manufacturing for industries we deem strategically important. So, not perfect, but I think by and large, this was done in a way that's smart. I just want to make one other point, since George didn't mention this, but good God, I have 2 Stanford degrees, and I taught on the faculty here, and I like to stand up for Stanford people, but you often read in the press this hapless Secretary of Energy, academic, and so on, couldn't be farther from the truth. I think Secretary Chu has done an extraordinary job. It's a guy who served with distinction on the faculty here, ran Lawrence Livermore Labs, extremely sophisticated, knows how to run not only large labs, which is a key part of what DOE does, an expert administrator, and completely apolitical. I mean, what could be better than that? And I think the real testament to just how well this guy did is when you look at who he brought into the DOE to execute these programs. And again, you will see literally recruited the top people from Morgan, Goldman, McKinsey. You have to say, gee whiz, that's really government at its best.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Can you speak up a little bit?
It seems to me that folks being able to choose, to be like a venture capitalist, basically choose high-quality projects that are well-vetted and go all the way toward commercialization. It's a very important role for government, especially since industry really isn't doing it anymore in very, very basic research. And if you try to vet it on those terms, you're going to miss a lot of things because not you, but the society as a whole is capable of vetting it. And I think one of the great things that the government has done is basic research, number one, and number two, devise a system by which that basic research can be transferred at the appropriate stage from the government to either a private entity or some government-private entity partnership, so that it can then take on some of the other characteristics you correctly pointed out.
I think there's no question the government plays a very important role and should and have an increasing role in funding basic research and ensuring that that process actually happens. If you actually look at what the real secret sauce of Silicon Valley is, it is that intersection of basic research from the defense labs and the national labs, combined with the universities, combined with the ecosystem that enables that to go through all the way to commercialization. And the government shouldn't be playing the role of picking the end companies or picking the end technologies that are creating the enabling characteristics. And in basic research, let the scientific community peer review what should be funded and what should be invested in. But I think a lot of the success and opportunity going forward is to double down on that and ensure that we continue to have that stream of breakthrough innovation that comes from basic research.
Yes, sir. I'd like to apply your analogy to biosciences.
Can everybody hear?
We were overwhelmed today with technical data on how the country is going to hell in a handbasket, driven entirely by uncontrolled increases in the rising cost of healthcare in this country. And yet, through my own experience and everything I read and hear about, the government, particularly the FDA, appears to be an increasing obstacle to the advancement in medical science that would and could and actually eventually will provide a curative approach to our healthcare issue. So in other words, forgive the long-winded lead-in, but today our whole approach to healthcare in this country is driven by maintenance of chronic condition as opposed to a curative approach. So, for example, if you look at stem cell research, huge opportunity, demonstrated ability to resolve all kinds of critical medical issues, and yet, as a class, severely underfunded. Okay, very difficult to create capital formation. I look at your list of VC recipe for success. All of this appears to be in place except for the part about the capital. And of course, that's because of the concerns about the regulatory environment. So I guess what I'm asking, using DOE, Steve, as an example of let's do things right, how do we apply that over in the FDA in order to restart our whole approach to healthcare in this country?
Well, Lenny or Steve?
Go ahead.
I have a quick point, Lenny. I'd love for you to add to it. First, few people understand, but the president's been just an unabashed champion of more R&D money. I mean, this is the first president who mentions putting more R&D in the State of the Union address. I mean, he has really elevated this. Most politicians don't talk about it because the benefits you get are 10 years, 20 years down the road, and who has time for that? But I think he gets this better than most. Second, I've been in very small meetings with the president where executives, including the head of Genentech, have said, look, we fundamentally need to redo the FDA, and the president has more conversancy on this issue than you would ever believe. But the president doesn't run the FDA. We all forget, like, oh my God, the president, he's in Washington, he's in charge, right? And so, I mean, he's going to snap his finger. They're appointed over time. It's a little bit more like the Supreme Court. It is very hard to change the FDA. And the reality is there are over 11,000 lobbyists in Washington just in the healthcare area. And so you get a new president or maybe a new FDA member who comes in and wants to change things. Well, there are 11,000 people whose livelihood depends on keeping the status quo. And so that is sort of the rub we face. And I would also suggest there's a new chapter to this which makes it worse, which is there is this new Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which is not only going to make this presidential election unlike any election we've ever seen, it also makes it very, very hard to get changes in some of the industries we most need, because an awful lot of people now have unlimited spending to keep things just the way they are. So it's a tricky minefield to navigate.
A couple of thoughts. One is that in the FDA, as in other regulatory agencies, they obviously have complicated trade-offs that they're trying to manage against in terms of what the objective function is. So you do want to ensure public safety at the same time that you're ensuring the efficacy of new products. It is true in most agencies, though, and it's particularly true if you go cross-agency or cross-jurisdictions, that speed is not one of the objective functions. And so that's most acute in permitting for new infrastructure. You know, one of the biggest constraints to alternative energy is a distribution system, a transmission system, and you can't get siting. So part of the issue around regulatory reform of this sort is not necessarily to change the standards. You know, you still want to have high standards for whatever the objective function of the agency is, but make speed to decision making one of the priority things that are measured and assessed against, and I do think that would help. It's particularly acute in things like devices and other elements where there is a global market and people are choosing to go through a process in other parts of the world and get it approved there, and that's where a lot of the manufacturing and further development will go. So if you look at what the President's Competitiveness and Jobs Council concluded as part of the review, this was an important element around regulatory streamlining, with particularly that objective of ensuring that there is quality and faster decision making both within agency, cross-agency, and cross-jurisdiction.
There's, by the way, a great cover story in The Economist just last week on that very issue, and I think ultimately what will happen here, especially in the life sciences field, is that China and India realize these are such huge opportunities for them. They will shorten the testing cycle, which will put increased pressure on us to move toward what I hope are a heightened system of best practices.
Excuse me, Bob, did you?
Well, but we don't adhere to the current regulations. I mean, we have to do for deadlines. The FDA routinely flaws them.
Yeah.
It's not a close call. They flaw it, and if they're even marginally, busy, they write you a letter and say, he didn't quite make it. They give us a call in 6 months. That's not adhering to the law that says make a decision up or down.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. If there's any agency that's ripe for reform and ripe for short-circuiting the bureaucracy, the FDA heads that list. And I think the President would say the same thing.
Laura?
I just want to say, I just heard Don Graves on this yesterday, the Treasury, the head of the President's Council on Development Competitiveness within the Treasury. And we had a meeting in Research Triangle back in June, and this issue came up. We were at a listening session, and the main issue was the FDA. When we brought that to the President, he actually turned around now, as a consequence of that, he's asked all of the independent agencies to basically do a complete review of all of their regulatory process, to come up with a plan, and the plan to have performance indicators for improvement. And that actually grew out of a discussion of the PCJC with the President about the FDA, because we've heard so much from the industry about this. So I think the President is absolutely, he's taken a move on this. It is an independent agency, but he's asked all of these agencies to come up with a plan. The plan is really to do a couple of things. One is to look through any duplicative regulations, but two is to come up with a process plan for improving the pace of review. Now, having said that, I want to say, because I think this is an now can I do something really unfair? When you get to
Yeah.
solar panel back there, I want to ask a question.
Let me try to spread it around,
Love it.
please, in the back.
So,
Thank you,
wanna
Mark.
Steve, I want to go back to your infrastructure point for a minute, because I think there are two endposts here. One is, you think about railroads, federal highway system, internet. We didn't string from Washington to New York.
I'm sorry, could you speak up?
Speak up,
We
please.
didn't string the internet, the railroads, and the highway system from Washington to New York. We strung it all the way across the country.
Telegraph.
You know, I think there is a question here about, when you particularly look at Cylindra. We tried something incremental and we measured it 10 feet into space, as opposed to we were shooting for the moon and did we get to the moon? And I think the flip side of that is, if China in fact is saying we are going to do this, and we're going to commit to getting all the way across the country, whether we like it or not, do we actually have to, on a competitive basis, say, I have to get into that game, I have to figure out how to be venture capitalists that actually succeeds in getting energy, whatever it is, healthcare, from New York to San Francisco?
Good heavens. Well, Laura, we're verging into your solar question right here. So let's tackle it head on. You could say, hey, look, the Chinese, when they go in with both feet and they don't stop till they get the job done. That's half true, and I appreciate that, but folks, that works if you have an autocracy. It doesn't work so well in a democracy, and I'm not sure anybody wants to make that trade-off. I would also say that what the Chinese have been good at heretofore, in solar at least, is investing in polycrystalline, and it's not so much that they're reaching new heights, it's just they're subsidizing an old and understood technology. I would still argue what the Department of Energy did was actually smarter, which is to invest in a basket of different technologies, not really knowing which one would be the winner. Cylindra turned out to be what is probably a less efficient technology and is a loser, and probably a loser for good reason. It couldn't compete. But the government has invested in a dozen other technologies, some of which will be breakthrough, some of which I believe will redefine the solar industry, because they'll be providing solar at 17, 19, 21% efficiencies at the same price, and will put the U.S. on top once again. I think we are, in fact, investing in future technologies, which is a much smarter strategy than simply subsidizing old technologies to gain market share for a temporary period.
Yes.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Steve. Various questions were going through my head. One, of course, since industrial policy is almost by definition about competitive factors, I was thinking about what some of the most successful examples of industrial policy you've seen sort of abroad that we don't do here. But then I thought maybe a more interesting question is some of the most successful examples of industrial policy you've seen abroad that you don't think we should do here. And then as a follow-up, are we impotent in the face of whatever example you might say? In other words, do we have an answer? If it's not something we should do here, how do we respond to it if it's something that's successful that the Chinese are doing?
Go ahead, Lenny.
Well, much of the examples outside the United States have been large capital deployments in industries that are deemed strategically important for the country, most of which are bad investments. So the landscape of industries or countries who thought that semiconductors was going to be their future and invested an enormous amount of money, with the exception of Taiwan, have been a miserable failure. And I'm not sure putting massive amounts of capital into things like that will be highest on my list. I do think, however, that there are countries who are much, much more effective at thinking about what are the enablers that can help encourage advancement of industries that they care about, not necessarily picking the winners within those, but encouraging the infrastructure development that enables technologies to scale, investing in encouraging the right kind of talent to come and stay. If you go spend time with the Economic Development Bank leadership in Singapore, you'd walk away and go, that we could use some of that talent here. They have much richer understanding of what the specific industry needs are and what they can do to compete. They're thinking about not last generation of competition, but they're thinking about what are the capabilities and technologies that we're going to need going forward. How do we ensure that happens here? Investing in the kinds of R&D support that's necessary there, encouraging the right kind of talent. That would be the things that I would be spending more time on.
Steve?
I would just, you really asked the key question, and I would just make 3 points. One, by and large, our government should not be bidding on companies per se. That is not what they do best. But I think there are 2 things we should be looking at. Areas that are strategically important, like solar or like wind, and investing in basic R&D in those areas is a smart thing, and let the marketplace decide who the winners or losers will be. But I think it's also important for the government to occasionally support certain behavior or outputs. For example, the government has a policy to provide a $7,500 rebate to people who buy zero-emission vehicles. I think that is a great thing. Now, whether they buy hydrogen, electric, or something in between, that should be up to the buying public. But I think that sort of policy makes sense. Now, one fine point on this. I hate subsidies. I think you do them very rarely, and you do them in a targeted reason where there are clear benefits, but they should subset in my opinion, 3 to 5 years. If it takes longer than that, I believe you're by and large subsidizing the wrong industries. The fact that we today are still subsidizing nuclear, coal, and oil is especially galling to the American public, and particularly oil in a time when we're having record profits. The fact we're subsidizing these industries to the tune of $3 to $4 billion is just downright obscene. So subsidies only in very specific cases when it fits certain specific policy prescriptions.
I'd like to add ethanol in there in that list.
I'm all in favor of that too. It's just poor policy economically and for the planet.
Yep. Sir.
The government as a VC has a little bit different power because they have both carrots and sticks. I mean, most venture capitalists can't demand something happen.
They do it every day.
Oh, yes, they can. Called metrics.
Thoughts on maybe get out of energy for a second into like digitizing medical records. Should they invest in that, like was done in the stimulus package, or demand it happen at a certain rate? And just your thoughts on carrot versus stick by the government.
Good God. Personally, I think they should, and for all the things that are going wrong and are challenging in our system, because we don't live in an autocracy, we live in a democracy, the good news is I think we're on the eve of a revolution in transparency. Let me just give you 2 specific examples. One of the things that I think is going to transform the healthcare industry is for the first time, a lot of us every 5 years are demanded by our doctors, go out and get a colonoscopy. Well, in the old days, who knew if the bill was $1,800 or if it was $900, you pay it. For the first time, you can go online and you can see, gee whiz, if I just go to a doctor 3 blocks down, I can get this done for half the price. People have the ability to save costs that they've never had before because of transparency, because of the internet. By the way, one of the things that I'm most excited about is Secretary Sebelius, who I know just a bit, but when she came to hire her head of IT for the Department of Health and Human Services, where did she go? Same place Dr. Chu did, Silicon Valley. Who did she get? A guy named Todd Park, who'd been the co-founder of a firm called Athena Healthcare. This is a guy who's founded a company from scratch, now worth over $1 billion, and that's the guy they went and got to help transform the healthcare IT industry. So good things are happening out there. I wish we could change some of the others.
Just got named the CTO of the government this morning.
That's what?
Got named the CTO of the government
this morning.
Lives
in Los Altos.
The analogy breaks down because the government is not an independent actor in all this. So they do play an extraordinarily important role, have in the past, both for creating demand and for setting standards. And I think those are very important roles to play in both of those. In the early days of the semiconductor industry, the Defense Department was 80% of the demand for the semiconductor industry. So it wouldn't exist if there wasn't that demand. There are other places where that can be true as well. The largest consumer of energy in the world is the U.S. Air Force. So setting some expectations about what the Air Force is going to do will help move the needle on some of these things. I also think standards matter a lot. And that's a role where, as an example, to go out of the current debate, I think, for example, Common Core and setting standards for what technology is going to be in education that enables the scale that's necessary to not have that be a district-by-district purchasing decision and create some opportunity for real R&D and innovation and education technology is a great idea and potentially very interesting in a place where, if I were looking at places where the U.S. ought to be leading a next wave of innovation, kind of figuring out ways to apply technology to human capital and thinking about how do we scale learning. It's a pretty interesting opportunity when you've got a lot of advantages where we could be winning in that marketplace.
That's a great point. Can I just
Please, Steve.
rewind on one thing? One of the people said earlier, you, that be careful about ethanol. And I would just make the point to all of you, when you hear ethanol, a lot of you think about corn-based ethanol. But I'm here to suggest that a lot of the ethanol in the future will be developed from substances we don't often think of, notably garbage. We have a firm, it's scheduled to go public next month, in fact, but that transforms garbage into ethanol at essentially $1.50 a gallon. You can sell it for $3.50 a gallon. So this not only solves an extraordinary public good of reclaiming our landfills, but gives us domestically created energy that is cost effective, and this is without subsidies. So there's new things happening on the technological front across the board, and again, for me, makes me feel good that going across the board, when you look at who are these cabinet people bringing in to help transform government, it's people from Silicon Valley.
Thank you for clarifying that. I did mean corn-based alcohol, because there's also switchgrass, and there's other, very, very inexpensive, if we can get through the cellulosic piece.
Yeah, so there's a continuum. I mean, and corn-based ethanol is really problematic. Cellulosic is really terrific because you can use sawgrass and so on, but even there you have to pay for the feedstock. The great thing with garbage is they pay you to take it, and as you all know, we're the Saudi Arabia of garbage. So it's a win-win for the U.S.
Yes, sir.
Steve, doesn't that point out just your example, the fundamental difference between what the government can do? In the cellulosic ethanol, the government has promoted a lot of research and development through NREL and other national labs, really up front, and it's not trying to get in the business of doing it, but it's created the opportunities for technology. In the corn-based ethanol, they set certain requirements that a certain fraction of fuel be ethanol, and so we have a lot of very uneconomical investments because of regulations forcing it. So in that latter sense, it was sort of like the beast of the federal government going in to try and decide what technologies they're going to force to go in, whereas the one you're citing is one that would they've enabled it by R&D.
So look, Professor Sweetie, my professor of energy, so God bless you. Look, no one that I know can justify this nation's corn ethanol policy. It is not driven by the Department of Energy. It is driven by pure politics.
It's driven by the Congress that passes that law.
It's driven by Congress, and as I joke, there's one area where the extraordinary partisanship that often brings our country to a halt disappears. And it's called the primary season in Midwestern states, when Democrats and Republicans lock together and all avow their fealty to corn-based ethanol. It's terrible. We need to change it. We're better than that.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned earlier that you wanted spicy topics for the late session. I have a spicy phrase, but it probably is very bland, meaning the valley of death. We haven't covered. It's basically the gap between venture finance and project finance, particularly for startups or companies that have big capital costs, like clean tech, for instance. And I was wondering what the thoughts of the two panelists are on the government's role in that.
You want to go ahead? No, go ahead. It's in your
So look,
You're on a roll, Steve.
Make sure my portfolio's on a roll. So this valley of death is a big thing. This is what Silicon Valley is all about. It's how can we come up with the next new thing that can catapult over it. And I think one of the smart things, again, the Secretary of Energy has done is said, look, electric cars will be a big part of the future. Solar will too. We're going to make a number of bets here. We don't exactly know where the winners and losers are going to be, so we're going to put a number of markers out there. That does two things. One, it gives you some diversification, but two, it helps build the supply chain. Having a supply chain for these new technologies is key. I was in a dinner that was much publicized with Steve Jobs and the president, Mark Zuckerberg, and the president said, God darn it, why can't you build iPhones in Silicon Valley and in the U.S., and the fact was we just no longer have the supply chain. So part of the government strategically looking at areas where that is important to maintain is, I think, an appropriate strategic goal. But you need to be careful, and you can't do it in every area. I think what we've done in the clean technology area is smart and will pay benefits for some time. Just one other word on Tesla, because this is one that I think is interesting. McKinsey just did a report that showed electric vehicles cost 75% less to operate than internal combustion vehicles. What the government enabled Tesla to do is build the first major full-on electric car manufacturing facility in the United States. And where did they choose to build it? In the business-friendly state of California. The firm now employs over 1,200 people and will be putting a car on the road in 4 months. It will have a range of 300 miles and performance that is equal or better than any BMW. So, I mean, this is pretty path-breaking stuff, and this is yet another example where I think people will look back and say, boy, that Secretary of Energy did a pretty good job here.
I'd add a couple things to that. The valley of death is real. It has also had very different causes depending on what industry you're talking about and why that's true. So it's a very different challenge in biotech or in the elements where it's a combination of regulatory time and process for approval and the capital requirements to get from here to there. That is a different solution than in some of the energy fields where the challenge is as much about clarity and security of demand. And so the government can play different roles in those that could be appropriate. But we don't have that conversation. It's like, well, no, it's the government should play a role or they shouldn't play a role, as opposed to let's be clear on what the market failure is and what can the government do that could help with that. I think there are some other places where financial innovation or the right kind of support for private capital would be helpful. So as an example, one of the reasons why some of these energy technologies are not scaling is because we don't have the transmission infrastructure. There are ways to help with that could be funded through appropriate kind of regulation, the right kind of pricing reimbursement, and public-private investment in infrastructure. So being clear about why is there a valley of death and what you might be able to do about it, I think is as important as talking about it at a high level.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to switch slightly because I think you've given a lot of very good answers in that discussion. But it struck me that a lot of this is both literally and figuratively in this room. And I wonder what your thoughts are about how the general concepts that you've been conveying can be better understood, better conveyed to the public. Because if the public heard a lot of what you're saying, for example, if you said, well, a few years from now, everybody will say that Secretary Chu was fantastic. Actually, I don't think they will. They will deny the fact that the government had anything to do with anything that happened, despite the facts. And because there's this built-in animus toward anything in this realm that the government might do. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we can all better convey to the general public the value of society, basic R&D, strategic government investments, whether you call it venture capital or loan or whatever, and the system that we have of being able to transfer usually at the appropriate time the technologies that have been developed that no venture capitalist, no business is going to put their money into development.
So this, I think, is a great question. What I like about it so much is, and look, with Secretary Chu, I don't want to overstate this, but I think when they look at the portfolio and all of the investments made on balance, because I have a good sense of where they are, it will end up looking like a relatively strong portfolio. By the way, outperforming a lot of venture portfolios I know.
People won't get credit for it.
But they won't get credit. And this comes to the second question, which is, if you're in government, I've spent 11 years of my life working in government and about 20 years in the private sector, and trust me, the private sector is more fun and it pays a heck of a lot better. If you do something good in the government, it gets zero press. If you mess up one thing, it can be on the front page. We need to get beyond that. In other countries, notably France, other places, you see the best people consistently going into government. They're expected to. It's viewed as a occupation with high prestige. Here, we don't have that. People in the government are looked down on, and as a country, we hold ourselves back. We have what is arguably the world's greatest economy. I don't think anybody would argue we have the world's best government, and we need to have a social discussion about that. But Laura, you of all people might have something to say on this. Do you want to weigh in here?
I think your answer is exactly right. I do think that we've had several decades now of defining the government as a problem, not a solution.
Yeah.
And it's gotten very deep into our political discourse and our set of beliefs. I think that kids grow up with that, they go to school with that. There isn't a kind of sense of common purpose. The government can help solve common challenges. I think it's a very, very big, we've dug ourselves into this hole over decades. I do agree, the press in general is what you hear as soon as you go into government. Basically nothing, you will not be praised for anything good. Watch out to avoid anything that can be criticized.
No, I think you're dead on it. We need to have an honest national discussion about it. And I think you all appreciate the irony. I mean, here are a lot of people who are making $100,000 a year, and they have a miss on Solyndra, and we say as a nation, those idiots. And then you have a lot of people making $1 million a year at any of the, I won't name them, but I could, 3 or 4 venture firms that just blew through $1 billion of investing in the very same company, and no one says a word. That's a much better job, and we need to make sure that all the best and brightest don't go off and do that. We have a national interest in getting more of our best and brightest to do what Todd Park's done.
One thing is recruiting people, but the other thing I think is being able to have people like yourself and other people in this room, when something happens, to positively to actually start talking about it and to resist the easy way, which is to just say nothing and let it pass. Well, Secretary Chu couldn't possibly have done that. It had to come from private industry. And number 2, actually extol some of the virtues of things that are happening when they're happening.
I have a slightly different perspective on this, which is I wouldn't waste my time with the general public. I think. Well, but let me finish. I think I do believe this is a political problem, but I don't believe it's going to get solved by solving it with the least common denominator public discussion in the House of Representatives or on the media that we have today. I actually think this is a problem where the business community in particular, not this interested in the particular topic, needs to engage and say this is an issue of national competitiveness and encourage the thoughtful folks who are trying to do something about this to have the cover to do the right things. That's where I would have the conversation. I wouldn't have it in the popular media. I think it's a waste of time.
So
Steve's going to create his own super
Now
PAC and solve the whole
it.
problem.
well, it will be doing that. But
Lenny, or Steve?
Look, Laura, I mean, you have asked one of the fundamental questions of democracy. One of the great things about the U.S. is we're always inventing our democracy. I mean, de Tocqueville came here 150 years ago and said, these people are fundamentally doing something different. We're doing something different again. So what's changed? 2 or 3 things all at once. The press media that we used to rely on to have highly educated people making reasonable, that's being eviscerated. But, so that's scary on the one hand. The good news is there's more and more transparency, more and more smart people on the blog. That's a good thing. The bad thing is there are a lot of things that are news networks that many people still think of as fact tellers. Forgive me here, but Fox pops to mind. This is not an independent news network. This is, it's almost the vehicle of a political party. So there's a lot of things we need to think about. This Citizens United issue, though, I would just submit to you, as someone who's worked on the insides of politics, is going to have more of an impact on democracy as we know it than any of these other issues. Get ready to discuss this. There's already a handful of people coming forward with laws. There will be This will be a cornerstone issue in the next presidential election. The next Supreme Court will be dealing with this. This issue is a fundamental one that will determine whether our, I think, democracy survives and flourishes or not.
Well, the context here, I think, keying off what Neil Ferguson was talking about, is it's another step in the erosion of our institutions. It's a huge step, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely frightening. And, I mean, I don't know where it goes or how we deal with it, but I guess we're going to have to deal with it in the way we deal with everything in the dialogue and in the political process. It's very difficult. You know, in just moving it outside the venture world or the so on, but the world I live in is not quite the venture world. It's almost impossible to have a rational discussion about the, quote, bailouts and the government intervention that was being described very articulately by a number of our speakers today as being things that if we didn't do this or the government didn't do this, we would have had a massive collapse around the world. It's almost impossible to have a discussion of that kind of in rational terms. It's all, as I said, I use the word theology. It really feels like a theological discussion to me. That, you know, it's bad or it's good or I'm right, I've got all the answers, I've got the only way, the right way. And it has to be looked at with a very set of specific, it is not wrong, let's put it this way, God did not say it is wrong for the government to be a lender of last resort in a particular situation. And I remember going back into the 70s, Chrysler. I remember also Lockheed Aircraft, both companies that have survived and appear to be prospering, although Chrysler had to go through a few rounds. Maybe Lockheed has too. But we need in our society to try to get away from making the other guy bad and get into solutions and to looking at specific solutions and constructive ways that we can use our government and our freedom to do something. There was a guy, and I think his name was Wolf, and maybe, Bert, you may remember this, but it was published by the Hoover Institution in one of the journals about 3 or 4 years ago. And he wrote what I thought was a seminal article, and I think he works for another think tank. And it was about how the United States embraced a secular religion in the early 1960s as sort of traditional religion was kind of fading into the background to some degree. And it's all about rights without responsibilities. This business of rights without responsibilities, I think, has gotten us into a real problem. And it's very evident in virtually all of our institutions. And I would submit, in many ways, it is particularly prevalent in the press. I've been dealing with a situation where the person involved has been seriously attacked, and to me, it's like an assassination. It's as if somebody took out an AK-47 and just shot him and his family. Now, you've all seen this and maybe have been a part of this. When I ask the lawyers, how do we deal with this? They say, well, you really don't have. It's going to take you the rest of your life and all the money you've got to be able to have some defense, if you will, about this through slander or whatever it is, because the First Amendment laws, as I'm now beginning to understand them, give such protection to free speech and to the much more so than probably any other country in the world, that it's frightening to me. I don't know if any of you have gotten into this at all, but to me it's one of the real problems in our society, that we have so little recourse, if you will, to a system of laws which gives some equal legal time and legal heft to people who are attacked by the press unfairly. Because once it's out there, you know, it doesn't do you much good.
This is a particularly important point in the advent of the internet, where the slanderous report can literally be around the world before you know it. Mark Twain said that a lie can travel around the world before truth has time to get its pants on in the morning. Right. And there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
Just on one positive note, though, I think a lot of us, and I completely agree with what Bert said, is that the ship in this country is holding us back, whatever party you belong to. And I would just note two things that I feel very good about, both of which I worked on with Governor Schwarzenegger. And again, you probably guessed I'm a Democrat, but it didn't bother me a bit to work with Arnold, who was a Republican. One of them was independent third-party redistricting. This is the best thing we ever did in California. You may not see the results overnight, but within a decade, you will see a substantially more moderated legislature that will be to the benefit of all of us. The national Congress should follow the exact same model. Second, we passed this thing called an open primary, where for the first time, you give people the opportunity to vote for whomever they want in an election. This is ultimately democratizing. Voter turnout goes up. It's something everybody should support, and that too tends to give you a more moderate legislature, which is, I would argue, a good thing. So hopefully, for some of the things California has missed, we can prove ourselves as a leader on the national level for election reform.
Can I add one other piece of that, not to continue with the reason to think that there's some ways out of this as opposed to it's an intractable problem with the media business model being destroyed. There's no reason why the next generation of social media and technology won't have as disruptive effect on the current media model that is built upon extremes as the first generation of the internet did on mainstream media. Because part of why this is going on is that's the way you get followers or readers or viewers that then supports advertising, and the super PACs and all the rest of that are feeding that. But it's also possible that if you look, citizens distrust all of that. The people they trust are their friends and family. And so, it's possible that the next generation of social media will help accelerate that. So as an example, you put transparency and speed of deployment, as one example, the Susan B. Komen decision and Planned Parenthood over the course of a weekend completely changed the decision. Now, what I feel about the decision, it's an incredibly powerful statement about what's possible with the power of social technology. So I think, it's going to get worse before it gets better. This election, all the super PAC money has already gone to negative advertising, and that's going to get worse. There will potentially be subsequent to that a pushback that says we need to have an alternative, and Silicon Valley and these technologies ought to be part of the solution space rather than just saying this is a problem, we can't do anything about it.
Right. He was first. Sir.
So there is a government entity that is in fact a venture capitalist. It operates mostly within the defense market called Incutel, which I thought wouldn't come up earlier here. And it does operate. I happen to represent a company that they've invested in, so I've worked with them before. And their policy is to invest in the company, take an equity position. Typically, it's investing in a company that is furthering some defense need or something. So I'm wondering, I don't have a problem. I personally don't have a problem with that. I might have a problem if they took the lead position and sat on the board. But I'm wondering what your feeling is on that model and how in the defense industry and others, because I think the defense industry is probably a specialized.
So you bet. Just briefly, in the original agenda, it was more energy focused, so that's why we were, I think, focusing on what DOE has done. But look, I think there are some areas, like in defense, but maybe others, agriculture, who knows, where you may want to be stimulating those newest technologies. And if you're going to do that, I'd argue a smarter thing to do is, rather than having some people in Washington do it, that you go out to professional investors like they did in Incutel. I think it's one of the smarter things that DOD did, and what I like best about it is they came out and hired guys here with an office on the ground. So I think that's a model the rest of the government should probably be looking at.
I think there are other examples where that's starting to be true, but could be extended even more radically as that is done. In CMS, they created an innovation center to fund things. Most of that's been public innovation, but the part of what is also going on is an enormous release of non-confidential healthcare data about costs and other things that could be very valuable, and there'll be a lot of businesses built on that kind of information. And there's no reason that the government shouldn't be helping encourage that kind of investment that leverages the transparency to help encourage innovation.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
One question. you raised the issue of partisanship. What is the likelihood that if a new administration is elected in this election, that a lot of the positive momentum we're seeing with the current administration, longer-term thinking, could be brought to a grinding halt because we have another party whose motto is drill, baby, drill, and reduce spending? And how likely is it that some of these positive initiatives could just be cut off?
You can answer that one.
From a totally objective point of view.
In full disclosure, I've taken a fairly large role in the president's re-election campaign, but I think it's clear to everybody, and I don't think this would be out of school to say, whomever the Republican candidate is, you would see a lot of the funding for renewable energy to go away. What's so interesting to me, and I'll just tell you this story, I serve on the Secretary of Energy's National Advisory Board. And there's another colleague on there who headed one of the largest companies in the world. And he was back in Washington testifying. And the member of Congress went on about how crazy the Kyoto protocols were and how he was going to stop all these things if it was with his last dying breath, and this was all manufactured by the Democrats. And he came up to the guy afterwards and said, "I sure hope you appreciate that show I put on. And by the way, I'll be seeing you when I run for re-election." And this guy, who was a Republican, large CEO, said, "You know, it's actually not helpful. And here's why. My company now operates in 167 countries around the world. Everybody else has signed on to Kyoto, except for the U.S. So I have to adhere to all these protocols anyway because we do business everywhere. And it's a little embarrassing that the U.S. is once again the last person there." So we'll see. I also, it's so funny, because you see the Republican presidential candidates and they're all denying global warming science and so on. But as I like to joke, that liberal clean tech crusader, Governor Rick Perry, he himself, when he's not running for president, has signed one of the larger renewable energy standards in the country. So I think over time, the country will continue to move this way. The rest of the world is. And the good news is most of these technologies are very close to grid parity, so they don't need subsidies, they don't need government support. It's the future.
I'd say one other thing, which is I would encourage you to ask the question tonight to Jeff Immelt, not about who wins or loses, but to say, outside of the presidential election cycle, is there a possibility that some of the things we're talking about could be enacted if there's a thoughtful discussion that happens in Congress? I actually am more optimistic about that. I do believe that there's an enormous amount of groundwork being laid right now for, assuming nothing's going to happen this year, but after the election, when you're going to have to operate and govern as opposed to run for office, that there is a lot of bipartisan consensus around this. The President's Competitiveness and Jobs Council that Jeff Immelt led had a series of bipartisan recommendations that are exactly the outline of what we need to do if we're going to try and address some of these things. They just need to get taken up in the right vein. And that's what I would be asking is, whoever's president, why isn't this happening? And in Congress, why isn't this happening? Continue to ask those questions.
That's exactly right.
If I could just make a perhaps political comment on the other side of the aisle. I've had the opportunity to do a business deal with Mitt Romney. I'm a private equity guy, not a venture capitalist. And it was an extraordinary, very productive, company building, creative, et cetera. So our experience with that particular individual, should he be the nominee, is that it's despicable, in my view, what he seems to be doing to try to, quote, stimulate the base or whatever the hell those guys are that have made me be an independent. But as an individual, he's a company builder. And, I'm not, if he were to be the nominee, I would not be concerned, particularly, that this whole momentum going forward would be cut off. Excuse me.
Yeah, Steve, I'd like to hear you, in the spirit of your comments, sir, I'd like to hear you speak about the differences between experience in the private sector operating as a CEO and operating in government. Governor Romney spends a lot of time talking about how, he's perfectly prepared to be president because of his background in the private sector.
Yeah. So, look, I think this nation is well served when you have
elected officials who have worked in both the public and the private sector. It's something I've tried to do. It just makes you a better person. I cringe when I see business people saying, by God, you should elect me and I'll just run government like a business. It doesn't work that way. But I think we're not well served to have people who spent their entire life in public service. It really helps to have done both. And I think, Romney is a very respectable guy with a great track record, and I just have to say, jokingly, I would welcome him winning because then I'd have 2 Democrats to choose from in November. No, it's a little hard to know where he.
Well, it's just awful. But in a way, it's not his fault. It's the grip that the Tea Party type folks have gotten on the Republican Party. I mean, I'm no longer a Republican because of it.
Isn't this an interesting issue? I've talked to the president about this. I think he actually respects Boehner a lot. I think he feels like if it was just him and Boehner, he could resolve 90% of the nation's issues. The problem is Boehner no longer has the control over his caucus that previous speakers had, because fully a third of them are Tea Party members, and it just makes it very, very hard for him. So hopefully we'll move beyond that.
So, our time is almost up. One last question.
I just wanted to follow up on that really briefly. There's certainly been a concern that the president does have a willing partner on the other side in Congress. And you speak to the House. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the difficulties in the Senate, particularly since after the 2010 elections, Mitch McCown said his stated goal of the next 2 years are to defeat Obama, not to pass any legislation.
Welcome to an election year.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not surprised, nor am I going to be disappointed if nothing happens. I'm be disappointed, but I will not. I mean, the fact that the jobs bill passed the House yesterday surprised me. It doesn't have a lot in it, but it's at least the right kind of direction. So I'm not surprised at that at all. I do think, though, you need to think about 2013, not 2012, for some of these things that are more possible.
I would just say 2 things. I think, personally, there's a very good chance President Obama will be reelected. I think a lot of the Tea Party members will not be reelected in the next Congress, and I think you'll see the next Congress get a lot more done. I will also say, as someone who's been an elected officer, all of us need to hold our elected officials to a higher standard to solve problems, not to be partisans. Some of the things I'm proudest of are the things where I cross party lines to do. It probably cost me a Democratic primary for governor, but you know what? We did the right things. The state's benefited. I cited 2 of them, the open primary and independent redistricting, and frankly, that's a good enough legacy for me. But you should all hold your elected officials to a higher standard. They should be fixing problems and looking to the future, not playing partisan games.
And with that wonderful wrap-up, thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Steve. And thank all of you for your participation.